Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. We got a great episode today talking about trauma-sensitive schools. And with this topic, it was sort of inspired by the first annual Trauma-Sensitive School Conference that's going to be happening here in February. And we're lucky enough to have two very, very special guests with us, Julie Beam and Melissa Sadin, who are organizing the conference. And so we'll give them a chance to introduce themselves here in a second, but I would just like to put out a quick initial thought on trauma-sensitive schools. I know we got a lot of folks that watching our podcast who might work with adults in criminal justice or homelessness or other things, and you might have the initial thought of, well, schools don't have much to do with what we do, but I really encourage you to listen to this episode, because from an advocacy perspective, creating trauma-sensitive schools in our communities is one of the most preventative things we can do for things like homelessness, incarceration, addiction, and so many other issues. And I'm sure that will come through very clearly in our conversations today. So also, I'm here with Jerry and Kurt as well. So we're going to try to do this a five-way this time. So always fun. We've been okay with four. We'll try five. So I want to just kind of start out to as our bright, shiny objects of the week, which we'll usually do, I want to start out just sort of with the question of how we've come to this movement of trauma-sensitive schools and any experience that we have had. And I want to start out with Julie and Melissa. Julie, maybe you can go first. Give us a little better introduction of yourself and sort of what brought you to this topic and organizing this really exciting conference that's coming up as well.
Sure thing, Matthew. Thanks for having us today.
Absolutely.
I am the executive director of the Attachment and Trauma Network, and I am first and foremost the adoptive parent of a child who had significant early childhood trauma and attachment issues, which is what brought me to ATN, the Attachment and Trauma Network, for support initially. And that's how we were founded, was a parent-to-parent and therapist-to-parent support organization over 20 years ago. The second most requested challenge or problem from families who are dealing with trying to help their traumatized children heal was around schools, because that's where children spend the bulk of their day. So for years we have struggled with, how do we help families and especially traumatized children. And this was long before we knew, as our organization, anything about the ACEs work, anything about the research there. And all of that about 2 or 3 years ago really started to come to fruition for us as an organization. We had several folks who are professionally in they're educators professionally, but also have had the background of living with traumatized children. And it came to the forefront, and we said, this makes total sense for us as an organization to start helping and working with other organizations and with educators at various schools to move this needle forward on informing educators on what it means to be trauma sensitive. And Melissa has really stepped to the forefront of leading that program in our organization. And then we just decided to bravely jump off the cliff into the world of a conference. And so that's been fun for us too. But my background is just that, is being a mom and being a business person and wanting to support families in the community. And that's where I've come from. So Melissa, tell them how you got started with us.
You made me do it.
I love it.
That sounds like a Nike commercial.
It's my life. It's all I do. I have been a special education teacher and an administrator, and I'm raising a highly traumatized child. And so I saw the need on so many levels. I saw it as a mom, and I saw that the teachers working with my child didn't understand. I saw as an administrator helping my own teachers try to work with these children who came from trauma histories. And then knowing Julie through the Attachment Trauma Network and understanding that if you want our country to move an initiative forward in a big way, you have to tell the teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Because many of the nation's biggest movements have come through the schools. And so Julie and I have done a lot of leaping, and we just won't stop until all of the teachers who work with children with trauma understand and feel confident in doing so.
Exactly.
Excellent. I just want to give, I know Jerry, Kurt, and I have thought a lot about this topic as well. So Jerry, I know we've worked with alternative school settings, at Denver Children's Home and each individually as well. I just kind of want to get your thoughts, somebody who's been thinking about trauma for a long time now. Sort of what's been your thinking, thoughts, and experiences around the concept of trauma-sensitive schools?
So I think the progression is in a treatment center. One of the challenges you have is that you have a part of your center that's geared towards traditionally treating the psychological issues of the child. And then you have an alternative school that's driven by different expectations, different rules, different regulations, in order to kind of meet the state standards, but also in just financially how to ensure doing it. And so for a very long time, as Kurt can, because he worked through this, there was always conflicts between the people doing the treatment and what needed to happen in school. And a lot of that had to do with there wasn't a shared mental model on what we were actually working on. And so it came to me based way back in the 80s and 90s to begin to look at biology, neurobiology, attachment, and later on the ACEs studies that kind of reinforced a lot of that, is beginning to create models that could transcend particular silos in the system I was working in. And so trauma became the initial model that we began to look at, and looking at brain development and looking at that. But as time went on, we began to really think about the reason we look at trauma is we want to understand how stress impacts children's ability to learn. But really what we wanted to kind of look at is how do we create the optimal learning environment for all children? And so we began to move away from the concept of trauma-informed sensitive schools to the concept of what we called safe, optimal learning environments, soulful schools. Because really, the things we'll talk about, and I'll get stopped, really are good for all children, not just for traumatized children. And so I think that as you started, when you talk about advocacy for any child, really, these are the foundations that we know help children optimize their growth and development, their capacity to learn and grow and function. So absolutely. That's how I get into it.
And I think it's really exciting, as I like when I talk to educators, is that, if we can create trauma-sensitive schools, and as Jerry talks about these classrooms, it not only raises the learning environment for those experiencing trauma, but for all boats rise with this time, which is really exciting. And it's a neurobiology base to all this. And that's why I'm really hopeful that this will become the foundation for all how we construct schools and classrooms, hopefully in the near future, if we're all successful at it. So
we couldn't agree with you more. I mean,
yes, I figured
we
we'd
truly
be on the same
believe
page with
that this is something that works well for all children, and that
Absolutely.
that the ACEs work drives us to that conclusion, because there are so many unidentified children who've been impacted by trauma.
Absolutely.
And there's no way that you're going to find them all. So
Yeah.
the children who are not traumatized thrive because they're already healthy relationally, and they are already able to do that. And the teachers know, even if they're not able to articulate it, that there is a significant portion of their class, of their students, that they just aren't meeting the needs of. The ones that they identify either through behavioral problems or through academic lags or whatever it is that they can't quite put their fingers on. And Melissa could probably speak in more detail to that, but they don't know what to do. And when they're presented with this information about the neurobiology of trauma and about how the trauma impacts a child socially, emotionally, all across all spectrums, the light bulbs just go off in the room. They really do.
Yeah. Melissa, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I agree with what Jerry and Julie said about it. It's good for all kids. And one of the things that I do when I work with schools is to explain, because they want to know, well, how do I need to find all of the kids who are traumatized in my class. And I can't stand at the door and say, hi, Sally, welcome to my class. Who beat you lately?
Yeah.
So I continually throughout the training remind them, you don't need to know. But there is an extent to which in a public school that's not an alternative setting, where there are children who are seemingly moving through the curriculum in an adequate way. And if you become trained and have a trauma lens, you may in fact identify that child is something Julie and I like to call a shapeshifter. And it's important that teachers can recognize these children so that they can get the wraparound services that they need. They do not need to be therapists, but they do need to recognize it. So it's important that you lead with the fact that trauma-informed care, it's care for all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, Kurt, I want to kind of phrase my question to you maybe a little more specifically. I want to get your experience with this topic, obviously, but I know Melissa mentioned special education as well, which I know is a shared passion that we both have through our experience and just, I think, fallen in love with these kids that we've worked with as well. So I want to get your sort of experience with trauma-sensitive schools and any thoughts you might have to add to this conversation.
Two kind of initially, and the first one is, I think kind of part of my role is to talk very succinctly about things and to bring some numbers to it, right? I love to quantify things. So I'll bring in some statistics to this. And something that Julie and Melissa, you were both alluding to, is a great statement I heard from a former boss of mine who said, the reason why we would be trauma informed is that there's no risk of a type 1 error. If we identify somebody as traumatized and they're not, we're not going to do any damage, right? We're still going to create an environment that's characterized by, positive repetitive experiences, things that are rewarding, and all those things are good for everybody. Whereas the type 2 error, if there is somebody who has a trauma history or is under extreme stress and we fail to identify it, we can do some problems. We can create some problems. So I thought that was a great way to kind of approach it from a mathematical perspective, which is kind of what I'm notorious for at times. So I really resonate with what you guys were saying about this is good for people.
Yeah.
This is good for human beings to have environments that are characterized by this.
Right.
And the other that I think is really important is that the idea of that, I think, Melissa, you said it, you don't have to be a therapist to still have therapeutic interactions, right? Therapeutic interactions can be really powerful, and we need lots of them to make a difference. But when I was supervising clinicians who worked in residential settings with really adolescents who were extremely traumatized, I would kind of wrap their head around this and say, you need to have the right tool for the job. And thinking about an hour a week of individual therapy as the right tool for the job is like trying to shoot a tank with a 9mm pistol. It's the wrong tool for the job. You need much more repetition and a much greater, larger level of repetitive experiences, because that hour a week could go wonderfully. And it's not that it's going to hurt. It's going to do some really good things for an hour. But we need the people who are interacting with these children 24 hours a day or 6 hours a day in a school to be able to pile up these positive repetitive experiences in a way that is the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
To build on that metaphor, you also need the right tool maker. If I can, I love a good metaphor. I'll ride this.
That's right. Ride it as long as you can.
Teachers love metaphors.
Yeah.
So, but one of the things that Julie and I feel very strongly about, and I'm so thrilled that she helped me to create a program within the Attachment and Trauma Network. Everyone who is on the Trauma Sensitive Schools team at ATN is an educator. Because I can't tell you how many times, all due respect to folks in the mental health, I'm not a therapist. I don't play one on TV. I don't pretend to be one. And I defer to the expertise of the therapist. But as a special education teacher, my directors would bring in social workers who would give me great understanding of what a child with ADHD might be experiencing, and then give me terrific strategies she used on a couch in a room alone with that child, with no help on how do I structure a math lesson for that child, and what do I do with that child when I have 20 other children and I'm trying to herd cats in a kindergarten classroom.
Yeah.
So it's very important that teachers join this movement, that they become experts in the field, because teachers have to teach teachers how to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a real interesting experience, Matt, if you don't mind me sharing it.
Go for it.
Because I'd love to get your take on it. So I was consulting with a special education teacher in a classroom, and he was treating kids who were dually diagnosed with an intellectual and developmental disability and trauma-related disorders. And he and I got together and we kind of looked at what should this classroom look like. And we created a model that, it had a base of positive, repetitive, rewarding experiences. And then we created pillars on top of that base that were things like, how do you address relationships? Well, social skills was one pillar, and another pillar was regulation, and another pillar was social skills or communication skills, and another pillar was, another area that addressed attachment and, all the problems that start to happen. And the roof of this structure was academic skills. And it was a really important kind of moment for him when he said, oh, you mean when I'm doing all these other things, I'm doing my job?
Right.
Because I feel like a failure that I don't ever get to the roof of this structure. And I end up getting mad at the end of the day and feeling like I'm not doing anything here because we didn't get to math today. Whereas all these other things were what led you to get to math. And I thought that was at least it appeared from my vantage point of an important experience for him. I'd love to get your take on that experience, and is that kind of what's needed in this approach?
Well, I applaud the way that you developed that. Again, the metaphor of a house with the pillars and the roof, that's outstanding. At the Attachment Trauma Network, we focus on 4 things: feeling safe, being connected, getting regulated, and learning. And when I put it up on a slide, it's circles to help teachers understand that these things all happen together and at the same time. And then when I talk about each one of those areas, I talk about specific classroom strategies, and many of them you mentioned, to help, because children with a traumatized brain must feel safe. Number one, they have to feel safe, because if they don't, they're frozen in some way, or they're fighting, or they're fleeing, but they are not learning. They need to learn to regulate themselves. That has to be a conscious, ongoing conversation. Where are you today? It looks like your lid is flipped. If your lid is flipped, to take, Dan Siegel's brain hand model, if your lid is flipped, you're not learning, but you need to learn about what your body needs to get itself right so that you can learn. And then being connected, again, all of these things are good for all of us. We need to be connected, and every child is not going to be connected to their classroom teacher, because a classroom teacher can't have a deep relationship with 25 kids. But the school as a whole needs to be very careful about the fact that every child is connected to someone somewhere in that school. And then when I get to learning, good teaching works for all kids, works for kids with trauma. One of the things that teachers are not being taught properly or in enough detail is executive function. And my hero around that is George McCluskey, and he's doing a lot of great work to help teachers understand why executive function needs to be taught in every facet of everything you do. It's very important for children with neurotypical brains, but it is essential for children with atypical developing brains, because if your brain has been impacted by trauma, it's very likely that your hippocampus has been impaired in some way. And while many of the executive functions are in the prefrontal cortex, if your limbic system development hasn't gotten there, you're not going to be able to do it. So you can't do things like make good choices. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's common, I tell teachers all the time, children with trauma they're not curious. I wonder why the sky is blue. My child at home, he never, ever asked me that once. He wanted to know when dinner was, because that was required for his survival.
You're curious about very different things.
Right. And then when I think about the gifted and talented students that I worked with, they were over curious about everything without ever bothering to solve the problem from the ground up.
Sure.
All learners need work in this executive function, and I beg the universities all the time to do an entire course on executive function. You can do an entire semester on it and what it looks like in reading, what it looks like in writing. And we're trying to get at this stuff with constructivist teaching, with project-based learning, with the inquiry-based science standards that are out there. It's all executive function development. And when you work with children with trauma and everything you do develops their executive function, you will increase their language development, their processing speed, and their working memory. They will learn.
Absolutely. Well said. The only thing I think I would add to this great discussion is that, I've had many of the same experiences that we've talked about, especially as I'm training more and more districts and educators on this topic. But to step back a little bit from maybe a wider angle, again, my work with adult systems, especially I do a lot of work for people working from a medical perspective or a social service mental health perspective with those experiencing homelessness and in the criminal justice system. And I like to really, to very much simplify the concept of what trauma does to people is that there's two sides of the trauma story. And the first side is the pain, the suffering, the neurobiological damage, all the science that we're seeing. And that's a terrible state for people to be in, especially if they're there and somewhat isolated or not getting the support they need. The second part of that story is actually the positive side of it is post-traumatic growth, recovery, increases in resiliency, wisdom, knowledge, that we're transforming that pain and suffering into strength and wisdom. And one of the things that just breaks my heart when I transition and do work with more adult systems and services is that before you walk into the homeless shelter, before you get arrested, as a society, we've missed opportunities to provide that healing experience for folks. And that's why I'm so excited about this topic, is because schools get kids for thousands of hours. And it only takes one person who understands this in that time in that district. And hopefully everybody in that district understands this eventually. But boy, if one person can say, maybe some of this kid's struggles are because of trauma, we can get that intervention to the individual in a way that means they don't end up with living in that first part of their story for their entire life. And that's why schools has to be a part of everybody's thinking around this issue. And that's why I'm so excited to see this becoming such a prominent topic for folks. So I want to ask the second question to Melissa and Julie. And I just want to throw out there too, I think all three of us would really reinforce this, that if you haven't ever visited the Attachment and Trauma Network site, it's a great resource and they do some amazing work. So I just want to thank you both because you've been a resource for me and my learning curves along the way as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, but I want to just ask, because the closest I've come to organizing a conference is to do a one-day thing, and it was local, and my head about exploded 5 or 6 times. Jerry was my keynote speaker, so I had to manage all that too. But he wants all the M&Ms sorted out. Very high need guy. So, but I know how much work it must take to do a national conference that you are doing. So I just want to ask kind of the simple question to both of you. Why'd you take this on? We're all glad you did, but what made you say, hey, this is the right time to do a national conference on trauma-sensitive schools?
We just really felt like one was needed. We're still not sure that we're the people to rise to the task, and we get out of bed every morning. I get out of bed every morning with a panic on my face, like, oh my gosh, we forgot about what kind of food we're serving, or how we're going to set this room up, or whatever the immediate panic planning. And yes, you're right, there's a steep learning curve that's going along with this, and so many people that are stepping up to do various tasks, and it's mobilizing an army. But we really felt like now was the time. We are aware, both through our own clients that we've worked with, as well as folks in the ACEs community and across the country, and initially did 2 audio summits, one in 2014 and then again this spring, where we brought together the people that we considered experts in this field. And surprisingly enough, they didn't even know about each other. I mean, it was sort of this mission to go out and reach out and see who was doing what. And there's pockets of brilliance across this country of people creating and remaking entire school systems, and communities coming alongside that in initiatives. And so we were trying to capture that. The next logical step is to bring the people together and to allow other educators to learn from those models. It's the concept of this conference has been warmly accepted. We had way too many people propose workshops. It was incredible, the response, and exciting too. Inundated our crew. I mean, we were just crazy trying to pick the workshops, and probably could have done 3 more conferences of equal quality with the people who we were not able to use this time. But it's yeah, you're right. It's crazy. And if we survive through February, we're going to be in great shape. But it's also exciting, and it's exciting to hear the enthusiasm of the people who are going to attend, of the people who are going to present workshops. We're excited where this is going.
Matt, I'm not nearly as humble as Julie, maybe partly because when I wake up in the morning and I panic and say, oh my God, oh wait, Julie Beam's got it. It's not a problem. I can go back to sleep. I might be more well-rested than Julie, but I would say to you, if not now, when, and if not who, if not us, who? Because I believe that ATN has the capacity to pull this off. We have Julie, we have a tremendous number of people who have business sense, organizational skills. We are all personally motivated by this mission. And on top of that, we have the Trauma Sensitive Schools team. And so we are amassing a team of experts from across the country who are working directly with us. And as Julie said, we've had education summits where we've pulled people together before. We just didn't pull them together in the same building. And so I think it's a part of our mission as a national nonprofit to create an opportunity for all of these experts to be together in one room.
And like Melissa just said, it really is hard work for us. I mean, we're all either parenting traumatized children or or our education team have been actively in classrooms and alternative situations and educational situations where we know that this is so needed. And so it's passion. This team runs on passion. So you telling us that our website is a resource is going to be a pat on my back for the rest of my day. I'm good.
Awesome. So I want to ask a very simple question, and I'm going to open it up to Jerry and Kurt after we give you guys a chance to answer. But what is a trauma sensitive school? I think for some of our listeners, they may, and we talked a little bit about this on our last episode, what is trauma informed versus trauma responsive versus trauma sensitive? So I would just kind of like to throw it out there, Julie and Melissa, to you first, and then get Jerry and Kurtz. If you would walk into a school, how would you sort of know that that school is trauma sensitive or on that journey, so to speak?
I have to give initial props to Chris Blodgett out in Washington State.
Yes.
He actually has published work that defines for us trauma sensitive, trauma informed, and trauma focused. Mm-hmm. And I want that work to get more press because I think it does give us an excellent framework. And it's very much, I like the fact that he has it's tiers. Trauma sensitive, as you have an idea, trauma informed. I also love, and when I train, I build a framework around SAMHSA's work. On the 4 R's. And so when a superintendent comes up to me and says, hey, how do I know my school district is trauma informed? And I say, you have to realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. And then I can define in a school all of the areas that you can do this, from changing the language of your policies at the Board of Education level down to the materials that the kindergarten teachers are using. And a trauma-informed school is one where everyone who works there, including the front office staff and the custodial staff and the bus drivers, realize the prevalence, the impact of ACEs, the fact that any child walking onto their bus or through their school could have and likely has some exposure to a trauma. The second thing is to recognize what that trauma does. So if I'm a school counselor, I will recognize a child who might need DBT instead of CBT. If I am the nurse, certainly I will recognize the somatic illnesses that so often come versus a child who has a true illness or a child who misses their mother. And the teachers would recognize and then to respond. So the principal needs to respond to the teachers and the children in a trauma sensitive and trauma informed way, knowing the children, providing individual responses to each child's needs, and then the superintendent who must set a system in place that cares for all of the adults that are caring for the children. Because, you mentioned that you work in an alternative setting. One of the biggest problems we have there is vicarious trauma. Mm-hmm. Because you don't have an opportunity, as I did in my public school setting, to have attachments with neurotypical children, and that stuff feeds you. Mm-hmm. So if your entire population, I was the principal of an alternative setting school, and I saw firsthand how it wears down the staff when the only other give and take attachment dance that you get is with your colleagues and not with any of the children. And things need to be put in place to repair and retain quality, healthy, well cared for adults, because then they will be better able to care for the children.
Amen. Julie, you have anything to add to that?
No, Melissa's brilliant. What else is there to add?
I know Jerry will say something, but yeah, that's kind of putting you on the spot there. That was beautifully said.
Yeah, I'm, first of all, I couldn't agree with everything you said. You said it in a really succinct way, so Kurt's kind of happy about that. And the question I have for the systems, my wife's a teacher, as Matt's wife's a teacher, and my daughter attempted to be a teacher. And there's different challenges when you're a teacher who's been teaching and learning to be trauma informed and trauma sensitive and trauma responsive, as opposed to new teachers coming in who are somehow overwhelmed with the tasks that they have, and the training they have doesn't really match the demands that they have in school. And so I'm really thinking about how not to only have trauma-sensitive schools, but trauma-sensitive training for teachers entering schools. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yes, my thoughts are yes, yes, yes. I saw NCTSN, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, actually created a college teacher trauma-informed curriculum and made it free and available. So I am working mostly at the state level right now with community colleges, and 3 of the community colleges in New Jersey are beginning to adopt actual curriculum into their programs to train the teachers who are coming out. It must be done. Rutgers has done some work, mostly in the School of Social Work. Their school psychology program is beginning to look at it, and I really hope that that spills over into their teaching, their pre-service teaching programs.
Great.
Awesome. Kurt, do you have any thoughts on this as well for trauma-sensitive schools that we haven't covered yet?
I think one of the ways you can tell, and Melissa, I think you were starting to talk about this, is that the questions you hear people asking when they meet with each other, I think is critical. People asking questions about what happened to this person and how would we look at this, or how would we understand this better. So the amount of curiosity that you see in team meetings and in interactions between professionals and between professionals and children, I think is one of those things that when I walk into a place, that's one of the things I look for, is how curious are these people and what are the questions that they're asking. A great way to from a just kind of a non-structural way, give a good feeling about whether or not a school or an environment is a trauma-informed environment.
Right.
Exactly. We talk a lot at ATN, both when we're training parents and educators, about the mind shift, about the paradigm shift in your thinking, about what a behavior means. I mean, we just get right down to that it's that we, the behaviors are not really meant to be changed. They're meant to be interpreted. And you have to understand, where the behavior is coming from, and that's a hard thing for us to grasp as a society. I mean, we've gone down that other path for so long.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think you guys, have covered a lot. I'll save my thoughts for the next question, but again, kind of want to start out with Julie or Melissa. One of you can take on this first, but. One of the things that I believe is that this research is really challenging some of how we've structured schools historically. Because I hear some of the same feedback of teacher after teacher that sit through my trainings talk about, I've got, I'm working especially in an intense setting that's at a military base, and a lot of issues around deployments, PTSD within the families, all these different things. And they're saying, I have 5 of these kids in my class that I know have ACE scores of 5 or more, and I don't have any para support. What am I supposed to do? And I think there's not necessarily, I can support them in thinking through this, but there's not a real easy structural solution with the resources that are currently given to schools and teachers a lot of times. And so the sort of the last question I have for our group is, as we evolve our understanding of trauma and neurobiology, where do you think schools need to be? And I love to be realistic. So let's say 10 years from now, what would you like to see? How would you like to see trauma-sensitive schools evolve the current model that we're currently applying to structuring elementary, middle, and high schools in our communities?
I had the good fortune to work with a superintendent in Somerville, New Jersey, Dr. Tim Purnell, who is now with the American Montessori School. Shout out to Tim, he's an awesome guy. And he seemed to grow in this work with me. I was a board member with him at the time, and take it to places that I hadn't even considered, because I would rather chew aluminum foil than be a superintendent. So one of the things that I can tell you, the short answer to that is to recognize the brain's needs in every facet of the school. So then, we're talking about reallocation of funds. I tell people all the time, this isn't going to require any more money. Just take the money you have and use it differently. So off the top of my head, I'm saying that every single school needs at least one, possibly two, full-time certified counselors and or school psychologists, not the people who are tasked with a 60-person caseload in the child study team or special education team evaluation, not that poor beleaguered person, an additional person who's there for all. In addition, I think every school needs an occupational therapist that is trauma informed. Occupational therapy is the way to help a child who cannot regulate in your regulation space in every classroom. If every teacher is taught how to help children regulate, whether they're 5, 15, or 18, and then sometimes a child, I sometimes need more than that. Sometimes in a meeting, I might need to leave the room for a minute because my physiological needs are so great. An occupational therapist in a space that has the materials can further the work that that child needs. So if you can replace your guards with occupational therapists and replace some of your paraprofessionals with school psychologists or counselors who can help not only the teachers, but the students. And if you create a curriculum that allows for all types of learners, then I think everyone is going to be a lot better off.
Absolutely. And I just, to reinforce the occupational therapist piece, when I was running a school for special education kids, as a mental health therapist, I kind of changed my title from therapist to an occupational therapy tech. Because they didn't need talk therapy. They needed the emotional regulation, the stim, all those. I saw bouncy chairs change people's lives. Just until we figured out that the mental health piece, if we work together, we got some really great results. But I learned very quickly that's where we needed to start. And for so many kids, I think that's a miss. As you said, there's not that capacity right now in schools to really train all educators on that. Because I think I think you nailed it perfectly, the power of that science. And for those of you that don't know what occupational therapy is, it's not about getting somebody into employment. Go Google it. That's what I thought. I was like, well, I was working with kids. Non-verbal
especially
kids.
from the sensory integration standpoint.
Absolutely.
And even the occupational therapists don't always relate to that as within their field. So that's a growing need that hasn't been totally recognized yet.
Absolutely. Julie, anything else you want to see as you look maybe 10 years or so into the future?
I know we've already said this, but it really needs to be that whole mind shift, that shifting of the paradigm. From a parent standpoint, which is the place that I have to talk from all of the time, because that's how I got to this work. What typically happens a lot of times, even if you get good occupational therapy and good support around a child, is that the minute that the child starts to be able to self-regulate, starts to be able to improve, then our model is to pull that away from them. And until we shift our entire system to where those things are just naturally in place for all children, and that it's not seen as a weakness to have to take a sensory break, or any of these other types of, building the relationship with somebody is not seen as something abnormal, but something expected that every child will do, and that we keep that in place instead of trying to wean them off, we're still going to struggle. And so that's part of what needs to happen systemically, I think.
Absolutely. Jerry, what are your thoughts on this, my friend?
The association that came to me is play. And we create all these programs that allow children to play. And I think that play is such an important developmental job for children that we, in our pressure to get them to learn academics, we miss the importance of them playing, exploring, learning, and the sensory stimulation that comes along with that. And so as we instead of thinking about what new things should we put into schools, is what were the things that were in our lives and in our communities that we lost that are really important and necessary. So I envision music and gym and recess and those types of things being seen as much as an important part of the academic environment, not just as we're stopping doing this for a little bit to go do this, but really what we're trying to do is facilitate optimal growth for children. And those things are an important component to help children's neurobiological system, their nervous system, to evolve and to become more complex. So I think as we look towards the future, is we really not just have kids sitting around a computer playing, but really out playing and engaging in exploration and finding joy in their bodies and in interacting with the environment. So I liked all the things that Melissa kind of outlined, but really what came to my mind is how do we teach kids and let them do what they naturally do is play with each other.
Yeah. And it's just one of the things that I become really hyper aware of too, is that academic performance, which is sort of that measure of success, is so much more than, like Jerry said, sitting in a classroom and having a cognitive experience. There's the social development, there's the physical development, there's the emotional, all these other intelligence come into play to create that learning experience. And you know, again, we see the cuts in some of the areas that we're limiting that experience. And I think we're seeing some of the detrimental effects of that as well. Kurt, what about you? What's some of your thoughts about, as you look at the current state of education, of where progress could be made in the next coming years?
Kind of summarizing, I think, what we've all said, and going back to the example I was talking about earlier, you know, one of the things I've seen over and over again, and I'm the behaviorist, but I'm going to talk about something going on inside the skin, right?
All
so
right.
I'm going to go that way.
Yeah.
One of the major determinants of behavior is the stress response and our perception of things. It really changes how behavior gets expressed. And one of the things I've seen children who are traumatized experience, and the people who are interacting with those children experience, is feeling like a failure and feeling like that they're not being successful because, like that teacher I was talking about wasn't getting to academics. He was worried that his boss was going to be mad at him.
Yeah.
And probably all those kids that he was interacting with felt like a failure because they weren't getting to academics, and that could change the way that they relate to each other. So as a behaviorist, one of the things that I say is how people think about things is part of the intervention context. And understanding that can really help us to give the right intervention to match with the way that people think about things. And so that's one of the things that I would hope could happen, is that we start to understand that when we create classrooms and create environments where people have rewarding, repetitive, rhythmic experiences that are all designed to help their brain to calm down, designed to help them build relationships, designed to help them regulate, that is doing our job. And that's getting us to do academics, which we all want to do in a school, right? That's one of the reasons why they exist, is for us to do academic work. But part of getting there is making sure that our environments are designed so that they support us getting there. So that's where I hope that it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I think the thing that I would add to that, I agree with everything said, obviously, but I'll approach it from a little bit of a different angle. Is I'm really concerned with this journey that sometimes we overlook the current structure of supervision and the role of self-care within schools as well. I know most teachers that I talk to, when you say, okay, what kind of supervision do you get? Because that's where I know I grew up as a professional in the criminal justice, mental health, and education, as I was lucky to have great supervisors like Jerry, who not only taught me things, because most of the time he showed up for supervision. So sometimes but I knew he always meant to show up. You know, he introduced me to the ACE study, but he also heard my frustrations. He heard when I was hurting because the kids I was working with and their families were hurting. And I really worry about teachers who may get one observation a year, and that's called their supervision. And so, Melissa, I believe it was you mentioned the vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. I know with my wife as a teacher, she knows there's a handful of kids in her class that struggle every year through something, whether that's a divorce or addiction or something going on in the home. And she doesn't get a whole lot of support around that, or at least no support in a structural way. So one thing I think teachers have got to start, and they need supported in this from all of us, to really prioritize their own self-care and understanding that, if you've got kids in your classroom that are going through hell at home or in the community, teachers hold that, and they watch. They get to see this impact play out hours during the day. And I think until we really take supervision and look at how to supervise and support teachers and paras and specialists in different ways, burnout and secondary and vicarious trauma will be a barrier to really getting these kids the services that they need, because they need from us such an emotional engagement and to help them regulate that if we're burned out or traumatized, we're not going to be able to do that. And I think that's one of the things that I see, hopefully moving forward, we start to look at that in a different way as well.
Matt, I have to tell you that my hero about teacher care is Mona Johnson out of Washington State. She does some of the best work, and her book speaks very clearly. So people say, well, how do I take care of my teachers? Go read Mona Johnson's work.
Great
I followed in her footsteps and just completed my own research on what teachers need. And I have to tell you that what they need is for everybody else in the school to understand the kids they're working with the same way they do.
Awesome.
Some of our, again, in New Jersey, we have a pretty sophisticated teacher supervisory model. So much so that maybe we need to leave them alone and let them do their jobs. But so I would say in New Jersey, we don't need to change supervision, because I can hear the unions yelling that means I'm going to have to walk through as administrator more times a year than I already do. But what I have heard from the teachers in my research were, like, some special ed teachers who are co-teaching, the gen ed teacher they're working with sees the child as willful and defiant. Mm-hmm. And the special ed teacher is trying to help the child regulate and trying to help the child make it more able to perform in an appropriate way in the classroom. And the teacher's like, well, I don't know why you didn't give them detention. So the burden to protecting the kids, the teachers who are trauma informed feel very much like they need to protect their traumatized children from everyone else's misunderstanding. And that, I believe, is single-handedly burning these teachers out. So if you have a school where everybody has the same level of understanding, then you're going to find that the teachers are getting the support that they need. Yeah. But that's cultural. At the end of all of this, I think you will agree, it's cultural competency. Mm-hmm. What do you believe about humans and why they do things?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I also would add that it's about state regulation.
Yeah.
And that when we're in a regulated state, we can be open, curious, and open to learning and experiencing. And when we're stressed, things are right and wrong, and people are right. So I think Matt's point about we can give lots of people lots of resources around them, but if they're so stressed, they can't make use of them. So it's not just the resources we put around them, but how do we look at what does it mean to really be trauma sensitive to teachers?
Yeah.
So that they're in the best state to do what we're asking them to do. And they have the right lens to do it. But oftentimes what I find with teachers, I just can't do one more thing because I'm in this state. That it's like, so what could I do for you to help you change your state? Not what could I do to you to give you more learning or more, can I just listen to you so you feel better at the end of this interaction? Or my wife, when she comes home, it's the same way. It's like, so I think it really to look at what can we do to create the optimal learning environment for teachers to do, just the same way we do with parents to create the optimal attachment with parents. How do we reduce the parent stress so they could be available to the kids? the parallel is in schools is how do we give you knowledge, skills, tools, and resources to do the things you need to do, to kind of look at that. So I think that your point about just sending more people in sometimes feels intrusive.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of hitting our time. I want to give Melissa and Julie sort of the ending spot here to talk about the conference and some details. There's still some registration spots left. Jerry and I will be there. So if you ever want to hang out with Jerry, this is your chance. They actually were nice enough. We're presenting a workshop on best practices in behavioral management and emotional regulation for students affected by trauma. So we will be hanging out, having fun, learning a lot. But I want to turn over Julie and Melissa to give us a little bit of details and information specifically on the conference.
Great. Thanks, Matt. We're so glad that you guys are going to be there. Just in case the audience doesn't know, February 18th through 20th, the Washington Hilton in downtown Washington, D.C. We tell everybody that the Reagan Airport is the easiest one to get in and out. But,
yes, it is.
And we also have a fantastic hotel rate of $159 a night at this. I mean, the accommodations are top notch. So you'll be well taken care of there. Our room block is only available right now through January 15th. So, and it's filling up quickly. So the first thing you should do, even before you register for the conference, I probably shouldn't say that, my accountant just went crazy, is to book that hotel room, because you need to have that nice comfy place to stay at the Washington Hilton. Then the next thing would be to go on our website at creatingtraumasensitive.schools.org, and it's a /conference, tells you everything you need to know about the conference. You can register there. You can, if you have a business or organization that works with educators or does trauma-informed work that educators could use, you can sign up to exhibit there. There's a variety of other pieces of information there as well. The conference is filling. It's not full yet. So take a breath and go register. And we'll be excited to have you there. There'll be 40 workshops and 4 general sessions with keynote speakers. We're excited about all of them. We've brought you the best and the brightest, and a lot of them are on our team as well. So you'll get to meet all of the folks at the Trauma Sensitive Schools team, as well as some of my parent trainers and folks that are dealing with our other programs as well. So we're very excited about this.
Awesome. Melissa, anything to add to that?
Yeah, the smartest people in this industry are coming to this conference. And as I mentioned earlier, our own Matt
What am I doing there?
We suck. All those people, and Jerry and I too.
Also, Mona Johnson will be there, and Bob Hull and Susan Craig and Ron Hertel, and we're just very excited. The brains coming to the conference.
We are.
Awesome. Well, I just think this is really cool opportunity too. And I know it was one of the reasons Jerry and I were really excited about it is, I imagine there'll be the 20th anniversary of this conference at some point, and you could be at the first one. And I get jealous of, I'm kind of getting up there in age now. I'm not 20 anymore, but the old timers who said, yeah, I was at the first of this conference or that conference. So here's your opportunity to be a part of the first annual one. So
exactly.
I know we're not going to stop talking about this subject anytime soon. So, and we'd like to extend an invitation to both of you when you get to recover, and that's up to you to decide how much time you would need. We would love to have you back on and maybe just talk about our experiences at the conference as well. I hope you guys have had as much fun as we've had on this episode.
Thank you, Matt. We definitely have. In fact, we already have plans for next year's conference. So we've decided to get our act together. So yes, we're on for next year and 20 years from now.
Awesome.
And when we come out of our exhaustion-induced coma sometime later in 2018, we would love to talk with you about
that's it. Like I said, you tell us when you're ready and we'll have you back on. So and at traumainformedlens.com or .org, excuse me, you'll be able to find show notes to this, and I'll get links from Julie and Melissa as well So we have links so you can learn more about the Attachment and Trauma Network, the conference in general, and any other resources you guys would like to share with our audience. So we thank you guys for being here. This was a blast. I know you probably got a lot of things to go off and do right now, but we're excited to meet you in person in DC coming up in February.
Thank you.
All right, everybody
Nice to
have a
meet you
great
all,
day,
too.
great
What
weekend.
you're taking on and pushing forward for the field.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people rooting for you, including the three of us. So,
Awesome. It's great to meet you all.
all right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.